Hi, I'm Ann Camden, Managing Director at G&S, and I want to welcome you here this afternoon. Thanks for dialing in to what I think will be a stimulating conversation with Chason Hecht of Retensa. We're going to be exploring the various tools that are available to companies of all sizes to evaluate engagement and the overall health of corporate culture. I want to take just a minute to tell you about G&S, the company that is hosting today's webinar. We're a mid-sized communications agency that has been around for right at 45 years. While we serve clients in a variety of industries from agriculture to elevators, working in both business-to-business and business-to-consumer communications. We have about 150 people spread out across 4 offices with supporting agencies around the globe. We focus on a select group of industries, and I think most of you who are on today's call probably fall into a handful of these. Over the years, we've worked closely with the C-suite executives in many of these industries, and we realized that employee engagement was a continuous theme and a business imperative. So with our expertise in communications and the ability to integrate with numerous departments and functions, it was a natural fit to focus on helping clients in the employee engagement space, and that's where I came in. For the past 4 years, I've focused the majority of my time to studying and counseling businesses on how to help get their culture to work for them. And that's what we're here to talk about today. What tools and metrics can you layer with one another to find unique answers to problems that you are facing, and where might you need to find a little more insight to help drive a little bit more action? But before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. You can submit questions throughout the presentation, and you should have a Q&A box on the right side of your screen. Also, we'll be using an interactive polling during our conversation today. So please jump in and participate. We'd love to have your input as we talk today. So we'll kick it off with an easy polling question. We have individuals from around the globe registered today with a variety of job titles. And this is pretty common as these issues fall into many different business areas. So we thought we'd see where the majority of the group sits in a corporate structure. If you could take a minute and fill out the poll. Excellent. It looks like we've got a lot of good participation and people from across lots of different industries, almost split evenly, which is pretty much what I would expect, kind of a blend between human resources and internal communications. And we probably all dialed in today for different reasons. If you're on the call, you clearly recognize why it is so important to have a strong culture with good engagement amongst employees. Not only does productivity improve, but corporate reputation is also heavily impacted by employees. It's a natural connection that customer experience improves when they are interacting with engaged associates. Most of us are familiar with Nielsen, and they recently released their 17th annual Reputation Quotient Summary Report. In it, they highlighted the importance of tapping into the employee base to build a strong reputation. It's a fascinating study, and you can see from the web catcher here that starting internally with individual employees is a foundation of building a strong culture. Their study profiles companies like Amazon, Apple, USAA, Kellogg, and Publix Supermarket. So their employee base varies greatly across those companies. And while we focus here a lot on science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM clients, we found that the criteria is still similar for everyone. Socially responsible companies with strong ethics and the ability to make a difference are key drivers to engaging today's workforce. So how does all of this come together? It's in the power of engagement. You have to win the workplace. We have found that it's the right direction whether you're working in the food industry, advanced manufacturing, or building products. When employees understand the vision and direction of the organization and feel valued by the organization, it all starts to come together. At its core, the formula seems simple and elementary, but it's not always that clean when you start to layer in different functions, business units, competition for resources, unique personalities, global workforces that define values and success differently, and that's where we started to develop our approach. As we talk about talent and culture today, it's important to think about your approach from beginning to end. At G&S, we start with data gathering, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But I think it's important to consider how to use that information to develop plans that are actionable, and that's where the process often gets murky. It's important to know how you might use the data and what that appetite for change will be before proceeding. We break it down into 3 major steps: gathering the information, mapping out the information gathered to understand the drivers, and using that data to build and execute a strong, actionable plan. Data is a huge mainstream topic right now, and it has never been easier to gather information. We'll put up a quick poll to see what kind of tools you are using this year. This is great. There's still lots of variety, lots of employee engagement surveys. Looks like most of you are planning on utilizing that as your number 1 tool. Personally, it's my opinion that it takes multiple inputs to get a good holistic view, and these are just a few of the popular survey tools that are used. But even more important is asking the questions. Are we measuring the right things? Are we capturing the data in a way that really gets a holistic picture? How are we validating the information, and what action items can we impact with it? When we start by answering these questions first and tying it all back to the business, we are better able to impact the business and capture the attention of the C-suite. Using the data from different sources allows companies to make changes and refinements that can impact that bottom line. Turning insights into action is more than just looking at a lot of data. From our perspective, it's all about using the information, both quantitative and qualitative, to use those insights to turn it into action. It's communicating, and we find that especially in STEM-based organizations, that associates want to know the data and the direction. What's the vision for moving forward? And finally, alignment is key at all levels, from individual employees to how departments and business units collaborate and share information. Keeping that alignment in check allows everyone to function at their top potential. And that's a great place to turn it over to my panelist, Chason Hecht. Chason takes it a little deeper. He is the president and CEO of Retensa, a company that focuses on retention strategies. And obviously, you can build a great corporate culture, but if you don't have the right people, then it won't make a difference. Before I turn it over to Chason, a quick reminder to please use the Q&A form to submit any questions. Chason, with that, can you please share your perspective on how talent impacts corporate culture?
Great, thank you so much, and I appreciate the context. And a lot of what you've talked about is the qualitative, which is critical to get to the root of why people join, why do they stay, why do they leave. The combination now with the quantitative is finally upon us. After several years of improving and enhancing how we ask questions of the workforce, we're now beginning to drill down on the data and the metadata and mining the employee experience in ways that we never have before. The tools that exist now are significantly further than we've ever seen. And it is that combination of the quantitative and qualitative that provides you with the accuracy to take action with confidence in ways that are cost-effective and time-effective. And so we're going to talk in this conversation about some of the tools. I want everyone who experiences our methodology and our approach always to walk away with one or two things they can use tomorrow. I attend webinars like these. I want to make sure that I get something I can bring back, and I think you're going to get at least two of them in this brief conversation. And what's the impact, that potentially these new ways of measuring the workforce, can have? And I think they're significant. The conversation, as Ann, recognizes, is circling around employee engagement, especially in the STEM workforce. And we care a lot about employee engagement. We care a lot about retention, of course. But if we're being honest, most of the C-suite does not think about this very much. In our experience, engagement might be called the broccoli of talent management. And we'll say to them, employee engagement is this and is that, and they're thinking, I know I'm supposed to know this, but do you have any cheese to put on it? Do you have anything that would make that taste better? Right? And so we go into our bag, and we quote things like engaged employees outperform disengaged employees by 20 to 28%, or engaged employees miss 20% fewer work days, where motivated employees, translate into somewhere between a 50 and 60% reduction in employee turnover. And then they quietly fall asleep. And so we're speaking that language, and in that language, nothing soothes an executive, like the sound of HR talking. We are often talking about our problems, and you probably have this feeling at times. You probably hear enough of other people's problems in our field and what you do, and that's something that happens too often in that C-suite. So what we've intended in the 15 or 16 years we've been doing this is to speak a different language. We want to speak the universal language. And it's not the international language, right? The international language is love. You may know that, but if you speak to the C-suite in the language of love, you'll be fired, or you might be promoted. Probably not the way you want to be, but we're going to speak in the language that is universal. And what is the universal language? Money. Mm-hmm. Every one of them is fluent in that. They all speak money. And the alleged cost of doing business of employee issues is far greater than most have calculated. So let's ask the first question. First question is, on your poll, have you ever calculated the cost of cost of employee turnover at your organization? And the answer would be yes, if you shared it with others. If you got a number and you showed it to somebody else, it's not real until someone else sees it. And if you put in more than 10 or 15 minutes but you gave up, that's okay. Note that. We want you to have that option. It certainly is warranted to have taken steps in that direction. And so if we're calculating the cost of turnover, what we're going to talk about a little bit later in just a few minutes is what we're going to do with that information. But I want to make sure that you know just how significant this number is, because it is often staggering. And the amount that goes into replacing, rehiring, and retraining an employee is so significant that it often is consuming half of an HR department's time and energy. The machine that needs to be built to rehire, re-onboard, and retrain is often overlooked as a cost of doing business. And so on the next slide, we're going to take a look at a spectrum of what we typically can estimate the cost of turnover to be at most organizations that you can use as a rough rule of thumb. Rough rule of thumb says that turnover replacement is about 20 to 200% of average salary, 20 to 200% of the individual's annual salary. And on the lower end of the spectrum, we find characteristics that it only takes about 20, 25% replacement cost to backfill people with low skills, high supply, a low ramp to productivity, where I'm productive typically in weeks, maybe 2 months, and I have simple and replicable routines. The characteristics of those people, typically housekeeping, food services, retail staff, those people typically are costing 20, 25, 30% to replace. When we look at the higher end of the spectrum, we're looking at people who are not being produced out of the schools as fast as they're being hired. There's a high level of skill set. There's a requirement for at least a college degree and maybe certifications. These people are certainly in low supply, even greater so if their influence is directly on the revenue-generating capability for the firm, engineers, consultants, developers, and there's a learning curve. In some cases, certain technical jobs could take 6 or 12 months. If you're in pharmaceutical field, easily will take 12 to 18 months to reach full proficiency in some of those fields, and maybe longer. These are engineers, they're clinical researchers, they're technicians. Business critical roles, sales, leading in sales roles, or directors can easily be 500, 800, or 1,000% of turnover. And so this is a more accurate picture when we look at the cost of an individual employee turnover. So how many variables do you think impact the turnover cost for a single employee? Given a few that I've mentioned so far, if you have any idea, throw in a number. And I am going to find the person who comes closest, and I will give them a prize. And after the session, we'll know who came close. Price is Right rules, as always, you have to guess, but not go over. And whatever you're thinking, make it a little higher. Unsure that it's higher than you think. So the variables that go into the cost of turnover include everything that it takes to identify and target and refine the applicant pool into candidates, and all the screening that we'll do, and the interviews, and the advertising, and all of the effort that it takes to then orient, onboard, hire. It's everything that is included in your recruiting team, and the bonuses and relocation fees, and the remaining staff's overtime pay, who is making up for the lost work from that separated employee. And it also includes the indirect costs. Harder to quantify, but certainly very real when we talk about employee theft. Loss prevention in retail organizations is a whole department because of what walks out the door. It's a very significant issue, and people who quit take more with them. The mistakes that are made, the lost sales, and the intellectual capital, the relationship capital that those people walk away with. When you start adding all this up, everything from the reduced morale to the reputation of the workplace, down to the binders used for orientation. We're the only company in the world actually that did this many years ago, because no one else honestly was crazy enough to do it. And it took months to identify 151 variables that goes into the cost of replacing a single employee. Now, some of them are more influential than others. Realistically, the most significant ones can be boiled down into a few dozen. But out of 151 variables, the implication is that if it's touching all those parts, if there's a cost associated in 151 ways, then it has to have more impact than maybe it was originally considered. And so if this isn't something that we're measuring, this is one of the most important things to start measuring. And if you aren't, at the end, we're going to give you a website to go to at least start that conversation. So what are we measuring now? What are we measuring, if not cost of turnover, but what are we using to measure the state of the workforce? And what should we be measuring? So you'll put in a response. We'd love to hear what you're measuring today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what is going to be most helpful. The data-driven solution is the only solution. And I think where the intersection exists between marketing, HR, and communications, and the people who are on this call, the intersection is around the reputational damage to the organization. That turnover is losing more than just an individual, but it's also losing a sentiment. It's also losing an employer brand. And what we know is that there's a greater value in our workforce than we previously considered. The idea that intangible assets have maybe grown into tangible assets is very real. Things like brand, for example. What is the Apple brand's worth? And by all accounts, it's billions of dollars. What's the carve-out of, let's say, Apple's employer brand? What is it as an employer? What does it mean to have thousands of applications for every job opening? What's the value of that? And so what we have is the need to measure data and the need to measure in two areas, what's driving the business and what's important to leadership. That's what we should be measuring. What's driving the business and what's important. And in particular, what can I do in the tracking around STEM workforce? How can I carve this out? And if you're doing employee surveys, and many of you are, if you're doing exit interviews, and many are, if you cannot carve out the insights among your STEM titles or those departments, why does STEM leave? If you can't do that in 3 minutes, you need new exit interview software. You need new survey system to identify why do these people join? Why does STEM join? Why do my engineers stay? Why do my technicians leave? And technology can do that. And that's a conversation that transcends across your departments and divisions. And when choosing HR metrics, we're looking for what is affecting this business-critical population. Whatever that population may be, we want to start to cut in that direction. So for instance, if we have a diversity initiative, if that is a project of a leader, then we're going to look at new hire by race. If there's a women's initiative, we're going to look at new job levels by gender. And by all accounts, if you're tracking performance, we need to cut performance across almost every factor that we're measuring in the organization. Promotion, tenure, turnover, and compensation. Performance is a very powerful insight on where to prioritize your actions. Because really what we want to do is support and affect and provide for those high performers in the organization. Well, you know, we're Retensa, and I have often said and continue to say that you don't retain everyone. There are people who should be working somewhere else, and that's okay. They will find fulfillment where they can, and I would wish them the best. But here at our organization, the people who want to be here, and I want to be here, we're going to do what we can to retain them. Those typically show up in the exceeds or the outstanding population. And if we're not paying them more, we need to look at that. But there's a breakdown in our system. And if we're paying them the same as everyone else, well, what is the motivation potentially for those high performers in that area of compensation? So when we're choosing HR metrics, it's certainly we can all feel like Charlie at the Chocolate Factory, I think, is this wide-eyed possibility of what we can look at. And that's exciting that we're able to do that. I think most important is the data that we can move the needle on versus where are my hands tied with leadership regardless. And so if compensation is not going to change and I can't do anything about that, then we need to know that before we go down that road. And I need to look to where I can take action. Universally, I'm going to give you a couple areas that would be valuable places to look. And on the next slide, I'm going to give you a metric that everyone can use and that you should be incorporating into most of your budget conversations. And that's total cost of management. The total cost of management, what it really takes to keep, develop, find, and manage and pay this individual over the tenure of their experience. And it is at the very least their annual salary plus their benefits and overhead, which for let's take a fictional $50,000 employee. A $50,000 salary employee might have benefits around $15,000, and they might have an overhead of about $10,000. So if we end up with about a $75,000 annual cost of this employee, very conservative, and I'm not including any other significant costs because we'll start with the very least amount that it could be. We've got $75,000. Let's say this engineer or developer stays for 4 years on average. That's their tenure, about 4 years. What I'm really talking about here is an investment of $300,000. This is an investment I'm about to make of $300,000 of company money in this person. And that changes the conversation significantly when we ask for a $20 reference interview to do more than just an employer verification, but actually let's get into the reference and let's try to capture their strengths and weaknesses. That's $20. I don't know if we've got $20. Okay, we're about to spend $300,000. And when we're about to spend $300,000, the context shifts tremendously. And then all of a sudden our budgets in HR and how we're communicating and what we're capturing, well, there's more room for investment because we can get a return on that investment that's greater than what we originally considered. And because the cost of losing them is greater than we thought, well, maybe this bookend of return and cost provides an opening, for more opportunity for the communications team and internal marketing to engage our workforce. And finally, I'm going to propose a truly radical notion. This is Retensa's radical idea for the day. Some of you calculated the cost of turnover, and you've got a number that you've shared with others. If you haven't yet, as I promised, on the next slide you'll see a calculator, a link to a calculator that you can use. What are we doing with that number? And here's what I want you to do. Here's my hope and vision for all of us. I want all of us to start charging the business line for it. I want to propose something truly ridiculous, that we charge back cost of turnover. And as absurd as that may sound, the case is now being made for carbon pricing chargebacks. 430 companies, including Goldman Sachs, GE, Microsoft, and probably some companies who are listening right now, your company is actually planning for a low-carbon future by assigning a price to greenhouse gases and then providing a charge list to the business lines that are producing it. And if they're that progressive on carbon footprint chargebacks, maybe we could add cost of turnover as a chargeback too. Maybe we can show that, this business line, cost $4.8 million in turnover because we lost this many employees and they're that expensive to replace. And here's what we're about to invest. I'm planning on hiring 80 people in this division at $300,000 each. And that's the universal language of money. And that's going to open up the conversation that allows us, who are passionate about engagement and retention, who are excited about the prospect that when looking at net income, high engagement companies had a 13% higher net income, while low engagement companies had 4% below average. And 4% swing, just a 4% swing, let alone the 17 across the whole span, but just a 4% swing for some companies is the difference between a best performing year and on the edge of bankruptcy. So at the very least, I hope we've shared some metrics that you can start using, and an eye towards approaching the conversation with leadership from the universal language, the one that will get the attention, that will get the budgets, that will help us to do what we know needs to be done in engaging and motivating our workforce. And I hope that's been helpful. I'm going to let you return the conversation, and hopefully what our participants can do is think about any questions that they have for us in a few minutes when we open that up. But in the meantime, Ann, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chason, for your insight. It definitely puts it in a different light when you think about it from the overall financial management and taking all the emotion out of it and really just looking at the numbers. That definitely changes the game of recruiting and retention for sure. So that's excellent. One of the things that we had talked about just a little bit in one of our previous calls that I was hoping maybe we could hit on again is, from your perspective, where does culture and talent intersect? Where do the two of those start to merge together? Yeah,
so, I was very fortunate. I was invited by some wonderful people in the building materials industry. Last week I presented a conference on culture, and this is at the forefront of the conversation. We've got fantastic quotes from people like Peter Drucker who say culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Sure.
And Stan Slapp says you can't sell it outside if you can't sell it inside, right? And speaking to culture. So culture, this exciting and interesting thing that we're able to create, that when you capture it the way that some organizations have, like Zappos, I think in their vision, for delivering happiness, they've done a fantastic job. What they did is said, this is the culture we're trying to create, and our talent management practices must align to it, and our recruiting, our hiring, our promotion, our pay strategies are completely aligned with the culture that we intend. So the intersection is, what is it that we want or trying to create here? What is it that we want our culture to be? My definition, when I say talk about culture, it's what people do when you're not in the room.
Right.
And if we're not in the room and people are taking action towards what they're passionate about, because we've hired people who are passionate about making others happy, or passionate about molecular gastronomy, or they're passionate about advanced material science and the difference that it's making in police forces across the country, then they're going to do that when we're not in the room. And so we're going to hire those people. I'm going to find those people. I'm going to filter out anybody who doesn't fit that level of passion, energy, and enthusiasm around material science. And I can't even spell material science, Ann, but I know someone who does, and I want them to be doing that. And that's what we do, honestly, at our organization. And I think anyone who's looking for a way to engage and develop and appreciate their employees, engage and appreciate and develop them towards the culture that they're trying to create. The people who don't align with it, the people who don't identify, will find that this isn't the place that I want to be. And that's okay. And respectfully and politely, we will help them find another place, because there are people who want to be in that conversation, and I certainly want them to be here.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see a lot more of that, how organizations are helping people to make that decision and go ahead and exit gracefully, if you will. So we have a great question from Lisa. She says, you speak to the cost of turnover, but what about the cost of low productivity? For example, an open concept office with limited control over disrupting fellow employees. What's your perspective on that?
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. So, it is something said in the work that we do that there's people who quit and leave, and then there's the people who quit and stay. And Lisa, I think you're talking about some people who left a long time ago, and they're still collecting a paycheck. So what we want to do in most cases is establish measures of success in an organization. Low productivity, very significant, it's very real. And if we have universal benchmarks, if we have universal standards for here's what it means to be successful at this organization, here's what success looks like, then it's very hard not to be that when everyone else is. And it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. And I won't say that this is easy to do. It's most challenging, and it's very hard, absolutely, when you try to establish a pay-for-performance plan. But it becomes very real at that point. So if you can exercise towards pay for performance without maybe instituting pay for performance, because you might not get buy-in for that. There might not be an appetite for that, and culturally that's very challenging to do. But let's take all the steps towards a pay for performance action plan that would identify the outcomes and behaviors that represent success, and that's the expectation that should be communicated in our performance management. We should be rewarding to that. We should be promoting to that, so that people who are there recognize, well, I'm not getting anywhere. As a low productivity, I'm not getting where I want to be, and people don't do what they're bad at for very long, and sometimes they'll recognize there's another place, or again, we can help them. And instead, those people who are mid or higher level productivity, they're seeing the reward and recognition supporting those behaviors. So cost of low productivity, in terms of quantifying it, is certainly challenging. But you can correlate that. The beginning of that is by measuring your levels of engagement, trust, and also just starting with, if we're talking about metrics we have that we can correlate back to productivity gaps, we can look at revenue per employee. Let's just start there. Let's just look at what the average employee, the average of averages, what do we receive per employee in this organization? And then if we differentiate a performance score directionally, maybe higher or lower, can we make some reasonable estimates in that gap? So once again, with a whiteboard, Lisa, and a slide rule, I could be very, very specific. But you're looking for what's our revenue for employee, and if we have performance scores, are people 10, 20% higher than the average? 10 and 20% lower. In practice, it's actually much greater, but you'll get buy-in. It's a reasonable estimate to say that people who are low performers are probably producing 10, 20, maybe 30% less revenue than those mid or high performers. And now you can begin to quantify the cost of low productivity. Again, you need revenue per employee, and you need performance scores to do that with accuracy. Without that, you can start looking at engagement, trust scores, and a few others, but it's a little softer. Ann, do you think that answered the question?
Yeah, I think it did. It definitely gives you something to think about and some options to pursue as you make those decisions. So I have one final question here. How would you describe the current corporate culture in STEM organizations right now? And are there some key watch-outs that people should be aware of?
I think the cultural desire and intention in STEM organizations is around innovation. People who are in these positions pursue it because they want to be on the leading edge, because they're stimulated significantly by new ideas. And that's not a healthcare organization, right? Healthcare, what's important to people in healthcare, for instance, is patient interaction, the difference I can make with another human being. Many people in STEM spend hours of their day avoiding other human beings and pursuing new ideas and thoughts. And so if you're supporting or you are building or growing your STEM positions, then what are we doing specifically around thought leadership? What are we doing specifically around growing and learning and development for this team and this population? Because when I get bored as a STEM employee, I'm done. I'm gonna find something else. And there's real implications. I think there were cultural changes in generationally, but let's also recognize that 5 or 6 years ago, they saw everyone they knew fired or laid off or lost their job because of bankruptcy or other economic concerns. And so they became irrelevant. And so they're very much in tune. If it wasn't them, it was their uncle, their brother, their sister, their mother, who became redundant because they didn't have the skills. So yes, it's intrinsic, and it's also a survival mechanism that they're driven toward. How was that, Ann?
That's terrific. I think that sums it up really well. Innovation is key in the STEM organizations that we're dealing with right now, and collaboration. How to build that culture where people feel like they're not necessarily always competing for resources and opportunities, but it's more of that friendly collaboration and not necessarily competitiveness, and it can sometimes be a fine line. So.
Absolutely, and you know what? It makes the broccoli go down easier.
I'm going to have to use that analogy. Well, I think we've come to the end of our assigned time. We had aimed for 45 minutes to give everybody a little bit of extra time left in their day. So Chason, I'd certainly like to thank you first and foremost. Really appreciate that. We have had some questions about could we get copies of this presentation and how can you reach out to both Chason and myself. We're both very available on our websites. You can find us both there. I think you can follow Chason on Twitter at retensa.com or at Retensa, and you can follow myself at Ann Camden. You're also welcome to reach out to either one of us, and we will be sharing some highlights of today's session, so please don't hesitate to reach out if that would be more helpful for you.
And if I could add, I want to make sure people have that calculator I mentioned was at retensa.com/calculator. Thank you. Make sure that they see that. That is not a public site. You can't actually go there anywhere else other than typing it in. So you do have to click on it. That's exclusively for our guests and invitees to use that calculator, and feel free as much as you want.
Terrific. That's much appreciated. Well, as we've talked a lot today about data and metrics and so forth, as you close out today, there's going to be a quick Survey Monkey. I think it's 5 questions that's going to pop up. We would certainly appreciate your feedback so that as we continue to develop more of these types of programs, we can continue to refine them. So please do take a few minutes, if you would, and offer that feedback. We would certainly appreciate that. And if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to Chason or myself, and we look forward to connecting and raising that bar a little bit more as we continue. So thank you very much, and appreciate your time today.